Okay, it looks like we're live. And I'm just checking all the settings over here on my second screen. And we have 14 people registered and just waiting for those people to join us. So welcome. I'm playing with Webinar Jam, the webinar platform here, and it is a long time since I've used it. They've upgraded the system quite significantly, so a lot of it looks different to what I'm accustomed to and what I remember. At the moment, I don't see names of the attendees, but I see people joining us. So welcome to everybody. I apologise for not calling out your names. Once I figure out how to display those, I may refer to you by name. I know it's rude not to do that. Okay. Hey Les, how you going? Welcome. So Les put in the chat to say hello. Who else have we got there? Paul. Hi, Paul. Good to hear from you. Hope you're all keeping well in this crazy time and feeling well. I'm looking forward to doing this webinar. I figured that one of the things that we can do is keep producing content. So that's what I'm going to do. I have done this as a live training in the past. So I thought, why not repurpose it a little bit for a webinar? Now, normally this is a 2-hour workshop, so I've pared it back quite significantly, but I'm happy to do Q&A at the end as long as is necessary. William, you've got a television broadcast starting right now. Okay, well, good luck with that, and certainly there will be a recording. Okay, I'll just wait another 2 minutes for people to join. And yeah, if you could pop your name and just say hello in the chat, that will be wonderful, because then I can refer to you by name. So I'm just going to type something in here. William is from Tokyo, so hopefully things in Tokyo are under control and you're keeping well, William, and good luck with that television broadcast. Okay. Let's see, what else have we got over here in this little control panel? Okay. All right, what I'm going to do is share my screen and make sure that's working. There we go. So you can see me in the bottom corner there. We'll hide this not sharing thing here, and I think it's time to start. So welcome to this morning for those of us in Australia of discovery and of podcasting adventure. And I know many of you that have said hello here have a message to tell the world, and it's really important to get your message and your value that you can contribute to this world out there in this day and age in particular. And podcast guesting, I think, is one really good way to do that now that we're in this world of social distancing. So imagine what's possible if you could get on 1 or 2 podcasts every month as a guest. Now, how many of you listen to podcasts? I know there's some of you here that have your own podcast, Les, for example, and I'm sure. So put your hands up if you listen to podcasts. So quite a few of you. And who's ready to be a guest on more podcasts? I know, Les, you've been a guest on my podcast, and I know William is coming on our podcast soon, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with him because I know he has a really interesting story to tell. So today we're going to talk about how you can land some guest spots on podcasts and how you can show up as your best self. I had a scheduled podcast conversation this morning at 8 a.m. and it was the second one this week where the person didn't turn up and didn't let me know that they didn't turn up. Now, that's really the extreme of not being professional. Of course, we're looking into our systems as to whether we did something wrong there in terms of the information we provided. But I did have one interview earlier in the week where the lady gave us glowing reviews about how wonderful the whole customer experience was that we provided in getting her on the podcast and making it easy for her to join and setting reminders and so on. So I think our system is pretty good. So not turning up is one of the big no-nos. Now, what I'll just go over quickly how we'll run this. So we're going to do 3 minutes introduction, which we're in right now. You can see the color code at the bottom of the screen so that you know where we're at. Then I'm going to spend 10 minutes or so on why podcast guesting is such a valuable way to get your message out. And then 5 minutes on what specifically is it. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time before we get onto Q&A on how to go about it, what to do before the call, what to do during the call, and what to do after the call. And then I've allowed 20 minutes or so for Q&A, but we'll take as long as we need to. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Jürgen Strauss. My business is InnovaBiz. I host the InnovaBuzz podcast. I also host the Tales of Marketing Transformation podcast, and I'm a conversation partner on Leading with Cultural Intelligence. So check those out if you haven't already done so. I'll ask you at the end to subscribe to that. Hopefully that's something you can do for me in return for what I'm sharing today. For podcast guesting, here's just a short snapshot of the podcast that I've been on in the second half of 2019. Now, the interesting thing here is that these people are introducing me to their audience who really trust them, who follow them, who consider them their friend, really. And they're introducing me as an expert in my field and in the topic that they introduce. So I'm getting in front of what is a new audience for me, and I have, to begin with, the host's seal of approval even before I get started. So how cool is that? You basically got a speaking stage in front of an ideal audience with the person who has the relationship with that audience endorsing you right up the front. Now let's move on to why podcast guesting. Podcasts are a really powerful platform to get in front of people today. They have been even pre-coronavirus days, but now as we're all in lockdown, it's something that we can still continue to do and very easy to actually get online, talk to people, record it and publish it as a podcast. You can really get out and reach people in your target market and access a highly engaged audience. The thing about podcasting is you have people, or as a podcast listener, you have the host in your ear. It's very intimate. And the host for podcast guesting, the host does most of the work to promote you. So it's much less preparation than setting up your own podcast. After the interview, the host does pretty much all the work to edit the show, produce show notes, produce and publish the episode. All you need to do is turn up and give your best value. Of course, just like any podcast, building relationships is one of the big benefits. It's low cost and no travel, which is particularly important right now because we can't travel around. And it does position you as an authority with credibility in your space, particularly because the host, who already has the relationship with that audience, is endorsing you as the expert in your field. And of course, done well, it can lead to new leads, a new audience, a new community, and ultimately to sales, because you can build on those relationships. Now, let's talk a little bit quickly about the benefit of podcasts. And I know there's some podcasters among the listeners today, so this is not new to you, but I'll cover it quickly. Podcast listeners typically are loyal, they're affluent, and they're educated. So a great audience for us entrepreneurs. The amazing thing is that 80% of listeners listen to pretty well all or most of each episode, and they listen typically to an average of 7 shows per week. So this is data from Nielsen in Q1 of 2018, actually. You can see here that the Q3 statistics on the slide, there's 50% of all homes are podcast fans. So that's US data. And when you consider how many that actually is, that's over 60 million homes. Now, 16 million people, they state, in the US are avid podcast fans. So they're the people that listen at least to 7 shows a week, and they listen to most of the episodes. Which, when you consider a video, say a YouTube video, often people switch off on a YouTube video very early on, even if it's the right audience, because they kind of get bored. And also a video does demand a lot more of their attention. So podcasts people will listen to whilst they're commuting, although these days we're not doing a lot of that, whilst they're cleaning the house, whilst they're mowing the lawn, for example. There's lots of activities where the brain can be engaged in listening to podcasts and listening to valuable information. So this is from Statista, the State of Podcasting analysis. I think it's 2018 data. And if you look at that, United States, Australia, about 33% of respondents have listened to podcasts in the past month. South Korea is very high. Spain, interestingly, is quite high, and Sweden. But going down that list pretty well, right down to the United Kingdom, more than a fifth of the people questioned responded that they were regular podcast listeners, certainly in the previous month. So it's a medium that is very popular right across the developed countries. Now, Seth Godin, who I'm sure you all know, said you should have a podcast. And he contends that a podcast helps us clarify our thinking and share what's worth sharing, which I think is a really important point. And it's a great chance to find your voice and a marvelous excuse to reach out and have conversations, important conversations that we need to have. And I think now more than ever in today's current situation, that is so important, that we continue all kinds of conversations rather than just lock ourselves away in hibernation, as it were. Now, of course, setting up your own podcast involves quite a bit of work, and producing it on a regular, ongoing basis also requires quite a bit of work. One good way to get started before you commit to that and before you decide whether that's something you want to do on a regular basis and you have the energy and the enthusiasm and the passion to do that, is guest appearances. That's a great way to start off, see whether it's for you, see whether you like the medium and whether it works for you, and then move from there. So frequent guest appearances, of course, do give you that platform, as Seth talks about, and do give you that opportunity to have those important conversations. And of course, it's a lot less work, as I mentioned earlier. Now, if you do have your own podcast, as I know some of you have that are in the audience today, then guest podcasting is a fantastic way of promoting your own podcast. So imagine getting on a stage with another podcaster, talking about your area of expertise, and then being able to refer people back to your own podcast where there's more of this wonderful information available. So it's a great way to promote your own podcast if you do have one already. The other thing I like to point out is that a podcast, particularly if you've got your own podcast, it's kind of a license to have conversations with people that normally wouldn't even give you the time of day. So just last week, I think I interviewed Gina Wickman, who's the author of the entrepreneurial, or the creator of the entrepreneurial operating system, I should say. He's the author of Traction, and his newest book is The Entrepreneurial Leap. I was able to bring him on because I invited him to the podcast through a networking process that I have, and he immediately agreed. So if I had have said to him, hey, can we get on a 1 hour chat because I want to pick your brain, he possibly would have ignored the message. He may have responded with, yes, my time is $1,000 or several $1,000s an hour. Whereas with my own podcast, I generally get almost 100% acceptance rate. I get to have that pick your brain conversation, and I get to share it with my audience. Now, of course, as a podcast guest, you need to take into the podcast that you're going on that sense of, I'm here to provide value to my host and to their audience. So doing that in a podcast, you have a permanently open communication channel with that person. As long as you give value first, the host of the podcast basically gives you free exposure, positions you as an expert, gives you an opportunity to share your message, and people usually pay good money for that kind of exposure. So who wouldn't want to be interviewed on a podcast? One of the things it does do, as I mentioned, it gives you visibility. So I had a quick look a couple of weeks ago at my LinkedIn profile and saw this message come up, 69 searches in a week. So tracking that back as to who's been searching me and where they came from, pretty well 60 of those came from the podcasts that I'd been on, either my own podcasts or the guest appearances. So it does really give you visibility. So how can you benefit from podcast guest appearances? Is this making sense right now as something that you should be doing more of? Okay, that's kind of a rhetorical question, but I'm hoping I'll get some response. Now, I'll move on to the what. So what specifically do I mean by podcast guesting? And essentially, it's speaking regularly to an ideal audience that is somebody else's audience, but it's their platform and you're speaking regularly on those different platforms. In a way, it's like face-to-face events, like speaking on stage, but online. So you could do webinars like this, or you could do podcasts, because with podcasts, of course, you've got the benefit of the host's audience. So by connecting with podcast hosts and people that have built up that audience, you get to reach a lot more of your ideal clients with your message. And some of those audiences range from 50 for some of the smaller podcasts to 50,000 or even more. The most important thing, though, here is not to really get seduced by the numbers. It's to find the right fit. So if you have 50 ideal prospects in the same room that you're face-to-face with, that's a really powerful opportunity. So identifying the right audience the better it is. And the larger the audience, it tends to be less likely that your ideal customers are there, or that many ideal customers are there. And of course, just like any podcasting or any production of content, it's not a one-off tactic. It's a strategy that if you adopt it, you need to be consistent with it. You need to try to get in front of the ideal audience regularly with the different platforms. You need to, or you can use the opportunity to practice and improve your message. And of course, it then improves your positioning as well. So speaking of positioning, here's just a couple of clips that we pulled out of my appearances on other shows. So you can see the Tony Durso show. You can see Live in the Feast, or Live in the Feast, I think it is. And the show host is giving me the privilege of presenting to their audience. And most, just like me, most show hosts are very protective of their audience. They're really keen to make sure that any guest adds value to that audience. So for them to allow me to speak to their audience with their seal of approval, that's just magical. I mean, that's invaluable. Like the MasterCard ad says, priceless. All right, so how do we go about it? I think there's 8 steps to this, and I'll keep repeating this. Your goal as the podcast guest is to serve the host and serve their audience with content that's of exceptional value. And of course, if you do that, you come across as being someone who's there to serve and who is an authority. So for me, the 8 steps are knowing who the desired audience is that you want to get in front, being really clear about your message, putting together what I call a podcast one sheet, or that's an industry name. I can't claim credit for that. The podcast one sheet essentially says who you are, what your key messages are, what you do, who you do it for, and some information that the podcast host can then use when they're publishing your episode. Then step 4 is finding the right podcasts. Step 5 is actually pitching the host. So saying to the host, hey, I'd like to be a guest on your podcast. Here's why you should have me. Step 6 is then the preparation. So being prepared to turn up on the day of the conversation to be your best right at that time. Then the actual interview, I put that in inverted commas because most hosts prefer much more a conversational style. Certainly I do. And then step 8 is the afterwards. So let's jump into that step by step in detail. First of all, the desired audience. So I will have a sheet for you that I'll share a link later on in the presentation where I've got a little bit of a workbook around podcast guesting and defining your desired audience. We've got a sheet there that tackles the why, the what, and the who of the ideal client. So you really need to know who the ideal client is that you want to get in front, that you can speak to. What are their problems? And how are you going to add value to that situation? How are you going to give them something that will help them on a journey from their current state, which, if it's a problem, is an undesired state, through to their desired state? Now, obviously, you won't make that transformation in one podcast episode, but you'll give them things that might start them on that journey. And if they're really an ideal client for you, and they're convinced that you're a good match for them, they're likely to want to continue that journey with you. And we have an exercise we like to do called empathy mapping. You'll see a bit of an outline on that in the worksheet when you look at it. So knowing the ideal audience, then step 2 is to get really clear about your message. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. Your primary purpose is to serve the host and their audience and always deliver exceptional value. And also, don't get on there to sell. That's just bad form all around. It should be informative. It should be educational. Ideally, it should be entertaining as well. One of the things when you prepare your message is to imagine that you're speaking to one person. It's a little bit different than a webinar here, where I do see some interaction. I see some attendees in the chat box here in my system giving me some feedback. So I know I'm talking to more than one person, but in a podcast, it's one person, because each individual, typically they'll have headphones on like I have, and they'll be listening in the earphone. So if you say things like "you guys," or "all the people listening," and I'm the listener, I'm here and I'm looking around saying there's nobody else here, it's just me. So that's just a little bit of a trick to be really personalized. So when you develop your message, consider an audience of one, and it's that one ideal client that you've defined in step 1. And then at the end of the interview, usually the host will say something like I do, which is where can people find out more about you and how can they get in touch with you if you're okay with that. And so you want to be able to respond to that with a simple, clear, single call to action. So it might be the best place to get in touch with me is my website. There's a contact form there, and send me an email and I'll get back to you to resume a conversation. It's very simple. Don't confuse people by giving them lots of different things to do. Or it might be go listen to my podcast and you can subscribe, and you give them the URL address of the podcast. But just one simple thing in the message. Remember, it's the start of a conversation, the start of a relationship that you're aiming for here. Now, the podcast one sheet, I'll talk a little bit about this one. It really is, the objective here is to make it really easy for the host, first of all, to say yes to your pitch, and secondly, that they have all the information they need to produce the podcast episode. So you've kind of given them all the information. They don't need to go and look for stuff and do a lot of detailed research. So it will have your contact details, what your relevant experience is matched up to the particular audience you're going for, what your specialties are, a little bit of a short bio. And the purpose of that is so that the host can actually read that when they're introducing you, so they don't have to make something up themselves. Then where your recent appearances are. If once you've started to appear on a number of podcasts, add those there, because that will give the host, certainly when I do my research as a podcast host, I like to listen to some recent interviews that the person's done. That gives me an idea of how they speak, how they pronounce their name, what kind of things they talk about, what kind of thing excites them, where they get passionate in the interview, and that really helps me as a host. So having that there is certainly something that's of value to your host. Then if there are questions you would like to be asked, then add those to the one sheet. So some example questions. And also I like to, and it should be invitation form there on the slide, I like to have an invitation form to go with that, so that people, when I send them there, they can actually book me directly. All right, so that's the one sheet, and that can be a PDF form, or it can be on your website. So I've got mine on my website, but I am considering doing a PDF version of it as well, so that we can send it out in email pitches. Step 4 then is finding relevant podcasts. As I said earlier, it's not you don't necessarily want to get on podcasts with a huge audience. You want to get on the right podcasts. So searching for podcasts, you can search in Google and Google Podcasts. Now there's a separate podcast search engine within Google, and Apple Podcasts certainly is the biggest directory, so search within there. Two other ones that are less well known but are growing rapidly are Listen Notes and Podchase. So they're really good places to do searches for podcasts. So search for topics, search for names if you know the name of the podcast, and also search for hosts. So if you've identified people that you'd like to connect to, then search for them on those search engines. And I think with Listen Notes and Podchaser, you can specify that you want to do a host search or an episode search. So if somebody's on an episode, so certainly I use that a lot when I'm doing research on my guests for my podcast. And also search for the ideal audience. So if you've got, let's say, my ideal audience is coaches and consultants in the technical industry. So searching for terms like that will also give you podcasts that target that audience. So now we know our ideal audience, we know our message, we've prepared our one sheet, and we've identified some podcasts. Now we have to pitch the hosts. And again, make it easy for them to say yes, make it a no-brainer. So first of all, how do you add value? Are you a good fit? And why are you a good fit? And talk about, what might be the problem that their audience could have and that matches something that you have a solution for. Talk about what makes you unique. Why are you different to the however many other people there are that might have a solution for that problem? Give them some example questions, provide the one sheet, and provide enough information in as concise a way as you can. And the best way to reach out to people is either email or LinkedIn. I've done it through LinkedIn. And as I said, make it easy for the guest to say yes, and don't make them do any work at this stage. So I've had pitches, for example, where it was an email. There was a subject, potential guest for your podcast. When I opened the email, it said, I would like to suggest Jürgen Strauss as a guest for your podcast. Here's a link to find out more. So they're making me do the work at this stage. And I do look at that, but I kind of think that's kind of putting it on me to do the work now. Whereas I had one this morning, which was a beautiful example. It was pitching to book authors who are about to launch a book on mindset, and they're actually a good fit, and we'll probably have them on later in the year. And it had about 2 paragraphs about their background and about the book and why they would be a good fit for the podcast. And then it had links to the book and their website. So that was, I was able to make a decision just reading that email in 1 minute that these people would be good guests. So that's the ideal situation that you want to pitch people with. Now, some people are busy and are famous, so they may not respond to somebody they don't know by name. So there's creative ways to overcome that. The obvious one is getting introductions from somebody that they trust. The next one is that I've used quite successfully is rather than sending an email, send them a video, either by LinkedIn or through a forum that you might both be on. I've done that with Seth Godin. In fact, I've sent him a video through a common forum, a private video, and got an immediate response, which is quite amazing. I'm sure that if I had have sent an email, he may not have ever seen it. It probably would have been filtered out by his assistant. So creative ways of making that pitch. And again, making it easy for them to say yes by giving them enough information and giving them a clear message about why you're a good fit and what value you add. All right, now this one This one is one I'm really big about. And as a podcast host, I see people do this really well, and I see people do this rather badly, unfortunately. So now that your podcast host has said, yes, we'll have you on the podcast, here's a date and time, here's how you hook in at that time, then you can't sit back and relax. Your work is not done. So what you need to do there is prepare to show up as the best version of you that you can. One of the things I think is really important is to listen to some of those podcast episodes that you're going to be on. That will give you an idea of how the show host runs his podcast, what sort of questions he asks. It'll give you an idea of the regular questions he asks. So, for example, I have 5 questions at the end that I ask every guest. Everything else is a conversation, so that could go anywhere, but the 5 questions are definitely the same. And sometimes people will act surprised over one or more of those questions and probably not give as good an answer as they might had they been aware that that was going to be asked. So listen to the podcast episodes, at least 2 or 3, and get to know how it works. Then make sure you know the show name, the host name, the pronunciation of the host's name and the show, and what the host calls his audience. So I talk to my audience as innovators. I say, hello, innovator, when I start off with. And the best guests I've had will actually talk to the innovator. They'll say, for your innovator, and then go on and deliver the message that they want to deliver. So that establishes you as a guest as a very personal connection to the audience. So really important to know what to expect. Make sure if you do have an offer or a lead magnet that's your call to action, make sure you have that ready, know what it is, can explain it very precisely, and can send the URL or tell them what the URL is where they can access that. And also what I like to have is an assets folder put together. So the assets folder is for the host. It might be your headshots, your company logo, and anything else that might help them when they publish the episode. So preparation, really important at that stage. Now, when we do the interview, as I call it, or as I don't want to call it, actually, I like to call it conversations, but it's the actual episode recording session. Now, the first thing, turn up on time. Well, turn up, first of all. As I said, I had 2 this week that didn't show up and didn't let me know. Turn up 100%, so be fully present, put your phone in another room, turn off all your notifications on your computer, be on time and be there 100%. Then the next thing is make sure that you clarify any host expectations up front. So if you've got an offer in your call to action, make sure that you check with the host first. Is that all right if I present that? Most hosts will say yes, but it's just good etiquette to ask that. In the pre-recording, make sure if there's anything else, if you have any outstanding questions, ask those there. Anything you need to know before the host starts recording. Then run it like a conversation. I mean, be guided by the host, but as I say, most hosts prefer a conversational style rather than just a series of Q&A things. And focus, be 100% present. I said that at the beginning, but it is really important. And focus on teaching and sharing, really serving that audience. And as I say, if you have a special offer, and give a call to action at the end. And even if it's not a special offer, use a call to action to get people to connect with you or to check out your website or to check out your podcast if you have a podcast. Now, once the interview is done and recorded, your job is still not done. One of the things that you really need to continue to do is keep building that relationship that you now have with the podcast host. So straight after the interview, make sure there's a few moments to have a quick conversation with the host, and you'd ask him things like, when is this going to be published? How are you going to promote and share it? Here's how I'm going to promote and share it. And ask him or her if there is anything specific that they need from you in promoting and sharing that. And also, is there something that you can ask for if you need extra things to promote and share that episode later on? Also ask them if there's anything else you can do for them. This is really important, and be genuine about this. Now, I ask that in the form of, is there someone I can introduce you to? So that's an easy thing for me to do. If they were to say, well, can you introduce me to so-and-so? If I know that person or I'm connected to that person in some way, well, it's very easy for me to make that introduction. And I think that's a fair offer to make. So ask them, how else can you be helpful? So as I said, you're there to serve the audience, but now that that's done, how can you serve the host? The other thing to ask for, and this is the host now serving you, is feedback. And ask for feedback in a very specific way. Ask them, what can I do better? What's one thing I can improve as a podcast guest? And that's quite a challenging question. A lot of times you won't get a meaningful response, but I think it's always good to ask that. And I always ask that question when I'm the host. And as I say, you don't always get meaningful feedback because often people are surprised by that question. However, I have gotten some really good feedback, really valuable feedback. And when you take that on board, that certainly helps to improve. And next time you are on a podcast as a guest, you can take that on board. Once the episode is published, then there's opportunities for you to promote it, first of all. So you should really promote it as widely as you can through all the social media. If the show host allows it, you can repurpose it as a blog post, which we certainly do with my guest appearances. Repurpose it as a blog post on your own blog or on your own website, and then link back to the host's content, of course. When the host posts on social media for that, then comment on those posts. Just write a comment in there saying it was a privilege to share this information with you and whatever else. And also the other one that I think is really important is offer to review the show or to write a review somewhere else if they would prefer, and ask for reviews as well. So ask them to give you a review. So there's quite a bit to do post-interview. However, as I said earlier, you don't have to edit the show or write the show notes or produce and publish the show itself. But you do have to help promote it, and working on the relationship going forward, of course, is something that for us networkers is quite a natural thing to do. Okay, three quick points about the tech, and this is for those of you that maybe don't podcast at the moment. I think even if you're only a guest on podcasts, it's worth investing $100 or $120 on a reasonably good quality microphone that can be plugged into the USB port of your computer. It will just give you a much, much better quality sound. And for good podcasts, quality sound is really important. Use a headset when you're on the podcast that avoids echo. And the third point I'd like to make is get into a quiet, echo-free location. So don't go into a big room with a stone floor and no curtains or no furnishings in there, because you'll get a massive echo. If you can, go into a smallish office with curtains and carpeted floor. If you can't do that, I have had guests that have spoken to me from their walk-in wardrobe, surrounded by their clothes. I have seen people, I haven't had a guest do this, but I have seen people do podcasts from underneath the doona in their bed, just to dampen all those echoes. So you can get creative, but if you have a nice small office with carpeted floor and curtains in there, then that's definitely a good way to go. All right, so just to recap, I think there's 8 steps in doing podcast guesting really well. Find out, really clarify who your desired audience is that you want to get in front, clarify your message, have a good podcast one sheet that outlines who you are and what value you add, find the right podcast to get on, then pitch the hosts, make it really easy for them to decide yes or no. Hopefully, if you've done the first 4 steps well, a yes will be a no-brainer. Then prepare. That's a really important step. Turn up for the interview or for the episode recording and really be your best, be at 100%. And then afterwards, do the promotions, keep building on the relationship. And again, I can't emphasize this enough, serve the host and their audience. That's your primary objective, and deliver exceptional value. All right, so what now? So imagine with this strategy of talking into a microphone these days, you don't have to go outside the house. You can have conversations with new, highly targeted audiences and easily build relationships with new leads, all contributing significantly to your business growth. So not only is podcast guesting really an excellent and affordable way to promote your business, to connect with influencers, and to establish yourself as an expert in your field, it's also great fun. And you can make it great fun. All right, so as I said earlier, I don't want to leave you empty-handed out of this. I have a podcast guesting template inside of our workbook. So it's at innovabiz.co/podcast guesting. And you can make a copy of that. It's a Google Doc. You can make a copy of that and then use it to plan out your podcast guest appearances. And if you do a pitch plan on that, send it to me. I'll give you feedback on that. I'll happily do that, give you some pointers. And yeah, that's pretty well time now to move on to the Q&A section. So I've got some questions here as prompters, and I see there's a few comments there. Paul, I was on a podcast with my sister-in-law called Nurse Manager HQ. She's based in Queensland and wanted me to talk about career transition for nurses. She uses Anchor podcasts. Who do you use? Okay, so Anchor is a really easy entry podcasting platform, and it works on mobile phones primarily. That's what it's designed for. There's a lot of negative talk in the forums about audio quality on that. Personally, I don't know what to make of it. I haven't actually looked at it in detail. I use Squadcast to do remote recording. So Squadcast is something that was developed specifically for podcasting, and the audio quality of Squadcast is just outstanding. It's probably the next best thing to being in the same room live with a person. So I use Squadcast for the recording, but then I host my podcasts so there's various places. So the InnovaBuzz podcast is at a place called Omni Studio. So it's the podcast host where the audio files live and where they're served from. So when people stream, that's where they come from. For Tales of Marketing Transformation, my podcast host is Captivate FM. For some of the other ones we do for clients, we use Whooshka. So there's different ones I use, but they're all the hosts. The recording part is for my interview ones is done with Squadcast. For the solo ones, I just do the audio recording on the computer and then do the editing through our editors. Yeah, that's right, Paul. Squadcast. Let me type it in here. It's squadcast.com. It might be squadcast.fm. In fact, let me bring it up on my third monitor and I'll let you know exactly. It is, in fact, Squadcast FM. I have used Zoom in the past to do remote interviews. Zoom, of course, has been in the news quite a bit lately. Zoom can do video recordings as well. The issue with Zoom for podcasts, you can set it up to do remote recordings in high quality, but it does require a bit of work for the guest to do as well. So the normal default setup, you can jump on and it records, but what it does, it records the audio that comes through the internet, so it's all compressed and the quality of the audio recording is actually not all that good. And particularly if you have a wobbly internet, it will show up on the audio. So I've had some bad ones in the past when I was still using Zoom that we had to redo because the audio was so bad. Squadcast records locally at both ends. So if I'm interviewing somebody in the US, for example, my audio is recorded here at my computer, and their audio is recorded at their computer in their office. It's uploaded progressively, so if for any reason we get interrupted during the call, nothing is lost. The recording up to that point is saved. So once we get back on, we just resume where we left off. And I can immediately download both parts of the conversation, or you can do up to 4 people. So it's a really good system. All right. So I'm curious, what's been most valuable out of the information I've shared so far? Let me just go back if I can. Just see whether Althea is my assistant who should be on, but I can't see her there at the moment. She's monitoring the other questions. Okay, thanks, Paul. You're welcome. Les, search, listen notes, and Podchaser. Yeah, there are specific search directories for, well, listen notes is a search directory for podcasts very specifically, and I find it's a lot easier to find podcasts there often than in some of the traditional ones. It's just a straight Google search sometimes is a little more difficult. Podchaser is an interesting one. It's got a search engine, but it's a kind of a community they're building of podcasters. So they've just launched a review system on there where people can review your podcasts, or you can review podcasts. And also you can put a profile up there as a podcaster or a podcast guest. I'm finding it's quite interesting to go through that, because podcasters often will have their guests up there with a profile on. So it's a good way to find potential guests for the podcast, or if you're doing research on a guest that you've already had on, or in our example here of a podcast you'd like to get on, then it's a really good one to do that specific search. Okay. So I'll just wait a moment if there are any more questions. So in the meantime, if you'd like to follow up with any more questions, please send me an email. You can use podcast-guesting@innovabiz.com.au, so I'll recognise it straight away as related to this presentation, and I'll know what I can do there. Les, where would you suggest I go next? Okay, well, certainly let's continue this conversation. I mean, I wasn't going to do any selling here, but we do have both training for people to put themselves out as podcast guests. We've got a complete system that goes through all of these steps in details, with all the templates and the emails that you can use to start pitching yourself, and the profiles for the podcast one sheet. And of course, you can do the training yourself, but it's actually written for someone in your team to pitch you as a business owner to get onto these podcasts. So that's one thing we have. And we also actually do the whole service ourselves. So I guess there's two options going forward, and that's that we pitch you as a podcast guest to the appropriate podcasts. We do all the background homework. We do all the search and discovery. We work with you to understand your ideal audience and your message, and then we do all the work up to and including preparing you for showing up your best at the interview stage, and then we help you with the promotion at the end. So we do that as a fully managed service, and we have a training program where we can train your team to do that for you. So get in touch if you're interested in either of those services. Yeah. Okay, we've got another question here. How do you manage time zones? Some of the podcasts I've been on are in the US. Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that we use for our own podcast is a calendar scheduling system. Now, the one we use is Acuity scheduling. There are lots of these around. And the beauty of these is that you can set them up so that, first of all, you can pick a time zone from the scheduler. So, for example, if I want to schedule somebody in for my podcast that's in the US, in New York, say, I will pick some times that are suitable for them, and I can pick that time zone in the scheduler. I just need to make sure that it's not middle of the night for me, and then I can schedule that. So generally that works very well. The tricky part is the transition time, so which is coming up right now, when we either go off our summertime or onto our summertime, and the other parts of the world like the US and Europe go onto or off summertime. That's the tricky bit. You've got to be aware of what's going on there. Now, there are some websites that allow time zone conversions in real time. So there's a couple of those that are worth looking into. And of course, the whole invite process that we use manages those time zones. So often I will do interviews with people on the East Coast of the US at 7, sometimes 6 a.m. my time, because that will be maybe 5, 6, 7 p.m. for them. So that kind of works at a reasonable-ish time for both parties. But yes, there's plenty of tools there where you can do that. And those scheduling tools are wonderful because we're currently booking out the InnovaBuzz podcast, and I'll just bring up those podcasts as a reminder. We're currently booking that one out for guests in July right now because the demand's so high. And the scheduling systems allow you to set up reminders that go out regularly to the guest and by automated emails, and also provide all the information in there. So that's a very useful tool. And of course, it reminds me as well. Okay. So I think we're getting on to the hour mark now. So if there's no further questions, thank you very much for being on today's webinar. Now, I'd love if you could leave me some feedback or just send me some feedback on the email using that email I gave you earlier. That would be wonderful because I'm interested in a couple of things. First of all, was this useful and how will you use it? Secondly, what was the experience like for this webinar? Because I am looking at experimenting with some different webinar platforms. And also, what else would you like to hear from me? Because I'm going to start doing these much more regularly than I have in the past. And now that we're all locked down, I think people are looking for information and content to consume. So thanks a lot, everyone. And I will close down the webinar now.